in our legal panel, this is Alex Little, a criminal defense attorney and former assistant U.S. prosecutor, and Michael Moore, a former U.S. attorney. Michael, let me start with you and get your just initial thoughts on William Barr's letter that we've been waiting a couple of days for.
You know, I haven't read the Cliff Notes version, apparently, of the Mueller report, but I've been watching some of the taglines and listening to your program. And it sounds to me like probably there's a lot of things now up in the Southern District of New York.
Oh, tell me more about that.
Well, I mean, just listening to what you've reported and what we've been hearing, apparently Mueller focused on Russia, as was his mandate. But we know that there are other things that are out there. We know, in fact, we got the Michael Cohen case with the payments to the porn stars and the playmates. We know we hadn't heard from Mike Flynn in a while. We know that Bob Gates is supposedly cooperating in other ongoing investigations with plural. So those things sound like they're still swirling around. While it's great to hear that the president and his team were not colluding with the Russians, and apparently that's what's in the report, I did take some interest in hearing that Mueller did not exonerate the president. I don't know what that means without really looking at the report. We can all spin it different ways, I guess.
I'm sure that members of Congress are going to really zero in on that. Chairman Jerry Nadler of the House Judiciary Committee has already said he would want to do that. But Alex Little, can I also pick up on that, because we haven't talked about this yet, which is that even in the New York Times the other day, there was the story that said, after the Mueller report, there's still a lot of legal trouble for the president up here in the Southern District of New York, for example. Is that, I have to ask you, is that fair? I guess it is what it is. It's out there. It
absolutely is fair. And what I think is important about the letter that the Attorney General sent is it is exclusively limited to the counterintelligence investigation involving Russia and the election. And we know a lot of what spun out of the investigation had nothing to do with that. For example, the Michael Cohen indictment and guilty plea, where the president was actually named as an unindicted co-conspirator. So there's certainly a lot of things that could impact the president about the Trump Foundation, about his taxes, that are going to continue to happen in New York. I think from a legal perspective, the most interesting thing in this entire memo is page 3, paragraph 2, that line about the determination that the Deputy Attorney General and the Attorney General made that this did not arise to obstruction of justice, because the sentence they use is actually not the law. They've created a sort of new definition of obstruction that is going to be unfamiliar to federal prosecutors. You don't need, and any federal prosecutor who's had an obstruction case knows, you don't need an underlying crime to get obstruction. And I think it's really, really interesting the Attorney General went out in 48 hours and made that sort of blank conclusion that there was no obstruction here. That's where Congress is going to focus with respect to this report going forward. That's
fascinating. Michael Moore, you want to comment on that?
No, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think the fact that we don't have a determination by the special counsel, but we know we've got all these other matters that are out there pending, I think that's that's telling. And I'm not totally surprised to hear the Attorney General make that kind of conclusion on his own. You know, he also submitted this memo, unsolicited memo, about whether or not there could be an investigation and an appointment of special counsel and obstruction, and we could go back through and parse the words there. So I'm not really surprised at this point to hear that he got there. But I do think, and you know, we've talked for a long time about this case being about money and following the money. I think there are other things happening in the Southern District of New York that ultimately could prove to be more harmful. What this tells me is that Bob Mueller did exactly what he was asked to do. He stuck to his mandate about the Russia investigation, and he farmed out to other districts, other U.S. attorneys, federal prosecutors to look at things that were collateral maybe to his initial investigation.
All right, thank you. Ed, did you have a question for these gentlemen?
Just real quick, Alex, last point. What do you see ahead in terms of this battle for the evidence, the actual evidence, and not the summary?
The historical precedent here is really interesting. You know, in the Nixon investigation, they put together a list of just evidence about obstruction that went to the grand jury, and that eventually made its way to Congress. What Mueller's done here, at least how Barr describes it, looks a lot like that. He said very even-handedly, point by point, here's some things that tend to make it look like the president's committed obstruction, here's some things that make it look like he didn't. That summary, at the very least, is going to have to make its way to Congress. If there is impeachment hearings or at least further oversight, it's going to focus on those back-and-forth questions about what the president was doing, when he's doing it. And last thing on that, by focusing just on the Russia piece, the Attorney General has been able to sort of carve out the obstruction that it certainly appears the president was doing with respect to Michael Cohen, the New York investigations. And so, you know, the president did a lot of things over the past 2 years that look like obstruction, and Congress is probably going to take a pretty broad view about that.
Alex, Michael, we appreciate your insight. And Dana, I don't want to one-up you, but I suggested...